In previous videos, we've looked at the development of pottery through prehistoric, Roman, and medieval periods. Now we're moving on to look at post-medieval pottery, which will be the most common type of material you're likely to encounter in field walking or casual chance finds, and on many types of archaeological projects. We're going to start at around 1600 CE. And before I get complaints, I know that's well into the early modern period, but it marks the transition in pottery traditions from an industry aligned on late medieval traditions to something else that becomes a lot more industrial. As ever, there's a lot of continuity. The Midlands purple and redware industries that we discussed before is still going strong. The redwares in particular were fast becoming the standard tableware across the West Midlands, and in the 17th century were produced in a wider range of forms. In Worcestershire, this is filling a gap left by the decline of the village industries. The Malvernian potteries had ceased production by 1630 or so. This may have been linked to deforestation of Malvern Chase and subsequent difficulties finding fuel, but there were probably other factors too. The difficulty with these newly dominant redwares is that we know they were being produced across a wide swathe of the Midlands and up into North Wales, but by the 17th century, virtually all potters were using a very fine fabric with some generic fine sand inclusions, but it is very hard to tell many of them apart. These are also plagued by inconsistent terminology. I'm calling them redwares because that's what most local publications do, after the bright red fabric. But up in Staffordshire, where many were made, they tend to be called blackwares, after the glossy black glaze. And that's perhaps a more sensible term, because a lot of the fabrics are actually much more varied, buff, pink, or orange. The tricky thing about these wares is that they were incredibly long-lived. Right up to the turn of the 20th century, you'd have seen market stalls piled with the stuff, country pottery, especially long-lived with the larger forms like big flared mixing bowls, panchions, and chicken feeders. So form is one good way to date them. Small cups are more typical of the 16th to early 18th century, chamber pots and jars 17th to late 18th, big bowls up to the end of the 19th century. Another indication can be the colour and quality of the glaze. This is by no means universal, but the earliest tend to have streaky or white speckled glazes. 17th century examples will often be consistent in colour, but have little bumps or patches where the glaze has blistered. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, a smooth, glossy black coat is typical. Elsewhere in the country, in the south of England or East Anglia, these red earthenwares tend to have different colour glazes, often green, and are collectively called glazed red earthenware, or GRE. There were other coloured fabrics too. One prominent in the Midlands has a buff or off-white fabric and a distinctive speckled yellow glaze. This is called Midlands yellow. Out of this tradition of mostly undecorated earthenwares came the development of one of the most distinctive and common types of British pottery, slipwares. They seem to originate in decoration on Cistercian-type wares in the 16th century, but really came into their own in the mid-17th century through to the end of the 18th. Slip is liquid clay, and what the Midland potters did to elevate it to an art form was to use contrasting colours to create elaborate patterns. Sometimes this was a simple case of adding contrasting dots, little pads of white clay, or letters to commemorate a life event. But at various centres, the key one being Staffordshire in towns like Burslem, new techniques were developed, involving coating a vessel in one colour and then trailing different colours across. This striking effect was achieved by drizzling parallel lines across the vessel and then dragging something like a comb across them. If you look at a fresh break, you can see the layers of slip in sequence. The Staffordshire products tend to have a very hard buff-coloured fabric. Other production centres included Harlow, where a metropolitan slipware with a more orange fabric was produced, common in the southeast. But by the later 17th century, Staffordshire products were achieving a very wide distribution. Perhaps the most common form is the large dish, sometimes with these pie crust edges. They weren't the only richly decorated wares to be gracing the dining tables of the day. We talked about late medieval tin-glazed earthenwares with a matte off-white glaze, blue or polychrome hand-painted decoration, and a buff or pink fabric. Before the 17th century, most of these were continental and are quite scarce. The glaze used Cornish tin, and it's a lovely example of a complex international supply chain. Tin exported from Cornwall to Holland and Italy, then used in the production of these gorgeous pots, and the finished wares exported back to Britain. The importance of Dutch suppliers is reflected in the term sometimes used for these wares, Delft. But just before 1600, a handful of Dutch potters began making these wares in Norwich and London. And then by the middle of the century, Bristol, Dublin and Glasgow were all major centres. Key to identifying this material is the relatively soft fabric, the matte finish on the glaze, and the contrasting colour between fabric and glaze. These are important because they're the earliest white glazed vessels that were widely available to British consumers. The demand for increasingly refined and light-coloured pottery increased in the 18th century as our fascination with tea took off. East Asian tea ceremonies were bound up with a long-standing tradition of producing exquisite porcelain, but imports were expensive and relatively rare. Tin-glazed wares were a bit too thick and chunky to fill that demand. The first locally produced refined wares were white salt-glazed stonewares. We've talked about the 15th and 16th century continental stonewares that were hugely popular. In the 17th century, we were still importing large quantities from the Rhineland, especially Westerwald stoneware, which had a grey body and cobalt blue and purple decoration. But from the late 17th century, English stoneware factories were being established, the earliest probably in London, but Nottingham became a very important producer. Nottingham stoneware typically has a grey fabric, smooth metallic brown glaze, and the key identifying feature is the appearance of a thin white band between the body and the glaze when you look at a clean break. Into the 19th century, stoneware became hugely popular for small ink or polish bottles, larger bottles, bottles for beer or carbonated drinks. They had advantages in strength over glass and in impermeability over earthenwares, and they were still popular well into the 20th century. But the key development in English stoneware which fed the demand for tea wares came in Staffordshire in about 1720, with the development of white salt-glazed stoneware. This used ground burnt flint and white clay to achieve a hard, durable and light vessel. The use of moulds meant that complex forms and impressed decoration could be achieved. It was sometimes painted, but is more often found plain. And the key to identifying this is the slightly dimpled effect left by the glazing process on the surface. Its popularity as a tableware was only really surpassed by another Staffordshire innovation in the 1760s, creamware. Through the middle of the 18th century, Staffordshire potters have been experimenting with all kinds of weird and wonderful refined earthenwares, things like basalt, jasper and Wealden wares. There's a good summary of these in the Shire book of post-medieval pottery. They're not the most common of finds, but they are important because they were all in some way responding to the challenge of how to match Asian ceramics for beauty and quality, and how to do this in a way that could also meet the market's burgeoning demands. Creamware was a key step. It was hard, durable, light, pale, using Cornish china clays, and crucially very cheap to produce. The key advantage over white stoneware was that the glaze was very smooth, which made decorating it much more straightforward. Initially this was hand-painted decoration, but the makers quickly perfected the art of printing designs directly onto the vessel. Plain creamware is probably the most common. Forms include plates, bowls, mugs, and it can look strikingly modern. Unlike later 19th century wares, the glaze doesn't tend to crack and craze. Get it in good light against something you know to be white, like a sheet of paper, and the cream coloration will hopefully become apparent. A slightly later but overlapping variant with a cobalt blue tinge is known as pearlware. This was very commonly decorated with blue Oriental style designs. Both the blue of pearlware and the cream of creamware tended to pool in nooks and crannies, like the inside of the foot ring of a bowl, which can help identification. One variant of the creamwares and pearlwares worth mentioning are the engine-turned dipped wares, sometimes called industrial slipwares. These were bowls, mugs and jugs with a range of geometric patterns in bright greens, blues and browns. Some had elaborate trailed cables of slip, or the dendritic tree-like patterns achieved by using a tobacco juice solution. The latter is called mocha decoration, though that term is often used collectively for all these wares. They look strikingly modern, and it's often a shock to realise you're looking at something 250 years old. Patterns were cut into the leather-hard pot using cams on a lathe, an ingenious technique. Now, as I've said, all these fancy white-bodied tablewares were attempts to imitate Asian porcelain. But from around 1750, English manufacturers were producing their own porcelain. Worcester was a key site. Others included London, Derby, Liverpool and Bristol. True porcelain is fired to a very high temperature, and it's translucent, so if you hold it up in bright light, you'll be able to see the shadow of your finger pass across it. There were different recipes: a hard paste, which was a close match to the Chinese porcelain, made with china clay and feldspar, and a soft paste, which had a slightly softer, warmer appearance, often using bone ash, hence the term bone china. Some vessels were plain and moulded, but generally they were decorated, either with a blue pigment hand-painted under the glaze, or from the 1760s with underglaze transfer printing. Other colours typically had to be added over the top of the glaze. Because porcelain was relatively luxurious in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's less common. But there's an important exception. If you're close to one of the historic production centres, then first of all, seconds were widely and relatively cheaply available. But also, factory waste was carted off by the sackload as rubble to fill potholes in farm tracks for miles around. This included vessels broken during firing and kiln waste, big coarse ceramic drums called saggers into which wares were stacked during firing, the strips of pipe clay that were used to seal those saggers, and the spacers that prevented the vessels from fusing together during firing. In about 1820, pearlwares and creamwares were supplanted by whitewares. This is something of a fuzzy transition. Pearlwares continued in use for some time, and the boundary isn't always clear. But whitewares were characterised by chemical processing of the clay, leading to a purer white colour and eliminating the need for cobalt. If you're struggling to tell what's a whiteware, creamware or pearlware, put them all on a white sheet of paper and the difference should pop out. The introduction of whitewares led to the mid-19th century boom for elaborate oriental patterns, transfer printed on mass-produced dinner sets, little teacups and enormous great vessels like this. The classic Victorian blue and white. Many of the most famous patterns will be instantly recognisable: willow pattern and Asiatic pheasants. Whitewares really represented the pinnacle of that drive to a cheap, affordable white tableware. And it was so successful that there's a good chance you've got some still in your cupboard today. An everyday IKEA mug or bowl is just a modern take on a 200-year-old product. Only instead of transfer prints of rustic oriental scenes, they've got your name, or a company logo, or an inspirational quote. That concludes our brief introduction to archaeological pottery. Useful links and resources are coming up. All that remains for me to say is I hope you found these useful. Happy hunting, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.